5-Minute Habits for Healthy Living. This week's habit is grieve your losses. Hello, this is Dr. Brian Morris, and welcome to 5-Minute Habits for Healthy Living, where you will learn the tools to practice a healthy lifestyle 5 minutes at a time. Life has become very complicated with a seemingly endless amount of health information at our fingertips. How do you know what to believe and what not to believe? On this podcast, I will sort through the maze of healthcare information and distill it into easy-to-digest, time-tested, evidence-based practical habits. I've been practicing internal medicine for 20 years. I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins. I trained at Yale, and I previously held a teaching position at Harvard Medical School. I currently practice medicine and hold a teaching appointment at UCLA Medical School here in Los Angeles, where I teach these habits to medical students, house staff, doctors, and of course, to my patients. Before we get to this week's habit, I'd like to remind you that the information contained in this podcast and at 5minutemd.com is intended solely for educational purposes and should not be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any health condition or illness. This information may not apply to a specific health situation and is not a substitute for medical care by a qualified, licensed, board-certified healthcare professional. Please consult with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your healthcare regimen. This week's habit is grieve your losses. Grief. We all know that word, but what does it really mean? And why is it such a profoundly important concept for all of us? There are many definitions for grief, but my definition is that grief is any unresolved emotional pain. We often think of grief as being solely related to the loss of a loved one, but the feelings of grief can relate to any loss. The loss of a job, the loss of a friendship, the loss of childhood. Even the loss of seemingly less important things like a sporting event can leave deeply rooted emotional pain behind. And this emotional pain of disappointment, frustration, and loss creates an emotional and spiritual process called grief. And this grief is a true health crisis in our world. Why is that? Well, when a child or an adult suffers a loss and grief is left behind in his or her mind and heart, then that grief needs to be handled and processed to move on and move past this experience. If you've taken any basic psychology classes or read any basic psychology books, you know that people experience emotional challenges that can lead to grief throughout an entire lifetime. A child can lose a friendship. Children can be uprooted and move to a new city or state and lose many of their relationships. Even sadder, a child can lose a grandparent or even a parent or a friend, creating tremendous loss and ultimately grief. And this can happen to adults as well. We all suffer loss at some point. An adult can lose a job or a friendship or a relative or some other relationship. No matter how idyllic our life is, at some point, all of us will suffer an emotional loss related to a friend, a family member, a teacher, a religious leader, or other member of our community. So let's start with how children handle grief. As a child, these feelings of grief can be truly terrifying, like a world is closing in and there's no escape. That's how it feels to a child when their fragile feelings are hurt, especially by someone close to them. So what do children do? Well, the feelings of hurt and disappointment are so difficult for a child to handle that most children need to do something with these feelings of loss. They feel the need to do whatever possible to get rid of these feelings, and there are many strategies that children use to hide or escape from these feelings of loss. There are many psychological tools that children use, including repression, denial, projection, displacement, and other strategies when they feel blamed and hurt and when they're grieving. For example, if a child is angry at a teacher, he might become angry at the family dog, which is a far safer way for him to process the pain. Or he might start to believe that the teacher is angry at him rather than dealing with the pain and sadness related to being angry at the teacher. Or the child might go into complete denial, denying that he has any unpleasant feelings. He might bury those feelings deep in his psyche. All of these strategies and many others are common strategies that children use to hide from or mask or escape from the pain and disappointment that they encounter in life. In the short term, these strategies can make the child feel better, but the problem is that all of this pain doesn't go away. It's just hidden. It's still there, deep, buried, and it can continue to mount. And if this process continues for years and years, the child may end up with a tremendous amount of unresolved pain, deeply rooted in his mind and in his heart. Pain that has never been fully processed and handled. So what happens to these children after years of repression, denial, projection, and displacement, and all these other strategies, is that they end up with all this pain within them. Sadly, some children end up using alcohol or drugs or other tools to mask and escape from these feelings in adulthood. So sadly, some of these children end up as adults using alcohol or drugs to mask and escape from the pain from these unresolved feelings. It is this process that is at the root of so many health problems that adults struggle with long after they have left childhood. The unprocessed emotional pain from the past, the grief from the past, is still there within many adults, deeply buried, and it can still have profound effects many years later. This may be 30 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 years ago, but that pain is still there deep inside, buried, and can still impact health. It will creep out at times, affecting people in seemingly mysterious ways, and I consider this a health crisis for some people. This unresolved grief can aggravate and trigger many health problems, ranging from high blood pressure to asthma to migraines to bowel problems to obesity to diabetes. Unresolved grief is a hidden health crisis in our world, one that I feel has largely gone unrecognized, but is at the root of so many health issues nonetheless. How can you get a glimpse of this? Have you ever felt sad or disappointed or frustrated for no apparent reason? Most likely this has happened because something occurred in your life that reminded you of a painful or hurtful time years ago that you've buried deep inside. And this is grief. This is unresolved pain, and it is still there deep inside of you, ready to be unearthed and processed. These feelings were never fully processed when you first experienced them. They were simply buried, but they can be unearthed and they can still be healed, even now, years later. It might take some work and some insights and the assistance of a trained professional, but that pain, that grief can still be healed. So what is my message here? The message is twofold. Number one, recognize and process grief when it occurs. That's the most important thing for children and for adults. Number two, recognize and process the grief that arises in you now. That is unresolved grief from the past. Recognize that, work with that, think about that, because that unresolved grief does still have effects on your health now. So the first step in healing any problem is recognition. So recognizing that grief when it arises within you is a significant step in the right direction. It's a significant step towards healing, whether it's pain from a relationship or a job or the loss of a loved one. Recognize that this is true loss and grief, and one that needs to be addressed and processed. And if necessary, it may need some work with a licensed, trained professional. And step two is the tougher step. Recognize and process pain and loss when it arises within you, whether it's related to a new situation or a situation from your past. So today's habit is about healing your past, healing your wounds, grieving your losses. If grief is unresolved and unprocessed, it will linger in your mind and your heart over time, and it can lead to serious health effects. So recognize it, work with it. Dealing with painful situations with tools like repression or denial can make you feel better in the short term, but it's not an effective long-term strategy. It's a strategy that will cause long-term problems unless you take care of the pain and loss and learn to move past it. And please never resort to alcohol or drugs to deal with grief. It's so common in our world today, but it's an issue that can lead to countless health problems. A wonderful book that touches on alcohol and loss is a book called Drinking a Love Story by Caroline Knapp. Knapp is spelled K-N-A-P-P. It's a very insightful and interesting book about how people use alcohol to deal with emotional pain, to deal with grief, and the devastating effects that can occur when grief is not processed. This week's habit is to grieve your losses, process the pain. Don't run away from the pain of loss. We will all experience grief in our lifetime. That's what makes us human. But don't run away from that pain. Process it, deal with it, grieve your losses so that you can move on in your life, changed by the loss that you've experienced, but emotionally whole and healthy nonetheless. Let's keep the dialogue going. Let me know what you think of this week's Habit for Healthy Living. Post your comments and your experiences on the 5 Minute MD Facebook page. Follow us on Twitter at Brian Morris MD, and visit us anytime on our website, 5minutemd.com. Let your friends and your family and your colleagues know about this podcast, and make sure that you are subscribed on iTunes. When you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, you will receive new podcast episodes as soon as they are posted. And if you're finding the information on this podcast helpful, we would really appreciate it if you would take a moment and stop by iTunes and leave us a review. Thank you so much for listening, and remember to make today count. I will see you at the next 5.